In the harsh lands of the Vikings, where icy winds pierced through mountain ranges, the ominous sound of war drums echoed. Most experienced warriors had embarked on distant campaigns, driven by a thirst for riches and the pursuit of new alliances, leaving only a small group of youths to guard their home village. It seemed a simple and routine task, yet fate was already weaving its treacherous webs. As night fell, the winds brought something far more grim and sinister than any natural force. On a cold and somber morning, the young guardians faced a discovery that would forever change their lives. They found an enemy camp, swarming with barbarians preparing a massive assault capable of wiping out everything they held dear. Unprepared and poorly armed, they were faced with a choice: survive or lose everything. But time was relentlessly slipping away, each second bringing the enemy army closer to the village, diminishing their chances of salvation. The only way out was to act covertly, relying on ingenuity and the will to live. But how could they confront superior enemy forces with so few resources? They understood they had to set fire to the enemy's supplies, gather valuable information, and return to the village before the enemy reached the gates. Every step became a desperate race against time, a battle against cold, hunger, fear, and despair. But as the group advanced, something remarkable happened. Those who had previously been at odds were forced to unite, to help each other, to become something more than just warriors. They transformed into a true brotherhood, and it was in this alliance that a strength capable of working miracles was born. At the same time, the icy wind swept across the boundless northern lands as Harold's forces advanced, a sea of shields and steel reflecting the fading daylight. Beneath a gloomy sky, where clouds seemed to drift heavily like harbingers of death, marched the formidable army of Harold the Conqueror. His ruthless and relentless ranks of warriors stretched as far as the eye could see, another destructive force on a continent already scarred by war. Each soldier was more than a sharp blade or a strong arm. They were an extension of their leader's cruelty, a man whose reputation preceded his steps and whose name inspired both fear and respect. Harold the Conqueror was not just a king or a chieftain. He was a living legend, forged in the flames of battle and tempered in the crucible of devastation. Born in the frozen wastes of Norway, ravaged by warring clans, Harold understood early on that to survive, he needed to conquer and subdue. His father, the great King Sigvard, passed down a legacy of martial prowess, but it was Harold himself who gained a renown that spread throughout the Viking world and beyond. Harold's first great victory came when he was still young, operating in his father's shadow. The city of Tønsberg, rich and prosperous, was the first to fall under the might of the Viking prince. Through a combination of cunning and brute force, Harold achieved his first great military feat. He besieged the city, and in a bloody siege that lasted weeks, he crushed all attempts at resistance. Tales speak of ruthless executions, the burning of entire villages, and men who, at the battle's end, chose death over captivity. But Harold did not merely destroy Tønsberg. He transformed it into a symbol, erecting an impregnable fortress on its ruins and declaring the territory part of his empire. In the years that followed, his campaigns spread across Norway, and soon Harold began to conquer lands beyond the seas, establishing his dominion even over the harsh and treacherous islands of Shetland and Orkney. His enemies, once renowned for their strength, fell mercilessly beneath the blades of his warriors. One by one, the clans of northern Scotland succumbed to the conqueror's sword, and Harold became known throughout northern Europe as a man capable of crushing entire empires with a speed and precision that terrified even the most seasoned strategists. The brutality of Harold's campaigns was not limited to the lands he conquered. He traveled from village to village, unifying peoples by force and threats. No local chief dared to defy him, for they knew that if they did, their land would turn to ash. When Harold arrived in a town, he brought with him a banner of blood, not only a symbol of his empire, but also a promise of devastation for anyone who dared to resist. And resistance, they knew, meant death. It was in his southern campaign on the island of Great Britain that Harold left his indelible mark. After crushing the Celtic kingdoms with an iron fist, he led his fleet to the English coast. The Anglo-Saxons, until then known for their military prowess and iron resilience, were unprepared for the fury of the Vikings. Under the ruthless leadership of Harold the Conqueror, England saw its walls crumble before the might of the Northern Empire. Employing formidable siege tactics, Harold stormed cities like York, obliterated entire villages, and drowned enemy fleets in the icy waters of the North Sea. He forced the capitulation of one of the greatest kingdoms on the island, and in his triumph, he ordered a colossal fortress to be built on the ruins of York as an immortal reminder of the power of his name. In an era of violence and absolute power, Harold the Conqueror's army earned its sinister renown. It was not merely an army, but a soulless war machine, driven by a thirst for revenge, plunder, and an insatiable desire for new conquests. Warriors, clad in armor and hardened by blood, were trained in the art of war from infancy, indoctrinated to kill and subdue without hesitation. With each victory, the army grew, its ranks swelled, and more territories fell under its merciless sway. It became a true nightmare for the southern kingdoms and, simultaneously, a legend whispered among the people of the north. However, the true terror lay not only in Harold's brute force, but also in his extraordinary strategic genius. He understood perfectly that victory in war was achieved not just through sheer power, but also through the cold, calculated intellect of a strategist. Harold conquered territories not only with weapons, but also with a keen mind. When his forces were at a disadvantage, he skillfully retreated, outwitted the enemy, exhausted their resources, and then, when the opponent least expected it, delivered a crushing blow with even greater fury than before. He was a true master of psychological warfare, skillfully manipulating the fear and overconfidence of his enemies, causing them to falter right on the battlefield. As Harold's army advanced across the snow-covered expanses, his victories were marked not only by physical destruction, but also by the indelible imprint they left on the cultures of the conquered peoples. Thriving cities were reduced to lifeless deserts. Majestic churches were put to the torch, and entire villages were wiped off the face of the earth, leaving no trace behind. But through all this chaos and destruction, Harold created something even more significant. He laid the foundation of a dynasty, solidifying Viking influence, which, despite all the devastation, gave the empire its own unique identity, an identity forged in the steel of war, fierce battles, and brutal campaigns. Thus, Harold the Conqueror became the greatest Viking of all time. With every inch of land seized, with every battle won, he left behind a trail of destruction and a clear message. No man, no people, dared to challenge Harold's empire without paying for it with their own life. The army that followed him not only feared him, but revered him as a deity, for they understood that his leadership lay not only in brute force, but in the ability to lead, possessing foresight, conviction, and an almost supernatural power over the destinies of his enemies. But what truly drove them, what gave Harold absolute control over his horde, was the ever-expanding empire, an insatiable hunger for new lands, untold riches, and even more lives to conquer. And so, as the conqueror prepared for another raid, the northern winds and the icy waters of the North Sea were not just a backdrop to his campaigns, they were a symbol of his immortality. However, Harold and his army were unaware that behind every victory, a new shadow would emerge, a threat even more formidable than any enemy they had faced, one that would soon make them question how far their power truly extended. amidst the boundless expanses of the North's snow-covered lands, where the horizon dissolves into snowy peaks and icy winds cut like sharp blades, lay a small and forgotten village named Skari. In the distance, beyond impregnable walls of stone and wood, the Viking city of Helstad, one of the region's largest centers of power, gleamed with the splendor of iron and fire. But while Helstad basked in the glow of wealth and grandeur, Skari remained humble, a small village desperately fighting for survival in the shadow of its elder sister. Despite its modest dwellings, muddy streets, and unkempt fields, the village bore a burden far greater than any treasures or material possessions. It held the indomitable spirit of a people who had never bowed down and who, despite all hardships, faithfully honored Viking traditions, passing them down through generations. Skari was not just a village. It was a symbol of resistance and resilience for the entire Viking people. Located just a few miles north of Helstad, the village stood as a small bastion, often overlooked by the powerful, but always on high alert, knowing that in a world dominated by mightier forces, any weakness could spell doom. Its wooden houses, from simple huts to more imposing structures, were built from logs felled in the surrounding forests, and their thatched roofs bravely withstood icy winds and sudden storms. Smoke rising from the chimneys veiled the gray sky, creating a scene where the warmth of human life mingled with the chilling cold of the surrounding nature. In Skari, survival was not a choice but a relentless struggle, a collective effort to overcome adversity where winter seemed to be the only true ally. However, the history of Skari village is rich with heroic deeds and immortal battles, many of which began with long journeys across the northern seas to uncharted lands beyond the icy fjords. It was founded by a small group of Vikings, descendants of great conquerors who had once settled in distant lands, but over the years chose this region to protect their families and continue the warrior traditions of their ancestors. The founding of the village was marked by a fierce battle with local clans who fiercely resisted the Viking presence, but were ultimately broken by the brute force and cunning of the Norse warriors. There, in the valley nestled between the mountains, the lands occupied by Skari were conquered by the sword and the unyielding will of its founders. Over the years, the village prospered under the leadership of some of the most celebrated warriors of their time. Legends say that the ancestors of Skari's inhabitants were direct descendants of the greatest Viking heroes, such as Ragnar Lodbrok, and that the village had always been considered a strategically important point for protecting the interests of mighty Helstad. Although Skari could never rival the grandeur of Helstad city with its imposing iron walls and thriving trade, it always held an honorable place among the Vikings of the region. What it lacked in size and wealth, it more than compensated for in bravery and warrior spirit. The current leader of the settlement, Bjorn Skaron, embodies greatness and impressiveness, bearing the weight of his name and illustrious lineage. As the son of Halder, the eternal warrior, who fell in a bloody struggle with the Saxons on Irish shores, Bjorn learned the undeniable value of strength and honor from a young age. Growing up under the watchful eye of his father, invincible in battles, Bjorn understood that his destiny was to protect Skari from any threat. Under his wise rule, the village prospered in an era of relative calm, yet with the constant sense that armed conflict could erupt at any moment. The young Vikings inhabiting Skari were descendants of ancient families whose names were etched into the village's history. From an early age, they were taught the art of war, and the battlefield was as familiar to them as hunting grounds or building a home. This group of young warriors who remained in Skari consisted of individuals from various walks of life, but united by a common goal: to defend their homeland and its ancient traditions. Most of them had no real battle experience, as they were shielded from the distant campaigns and trade expeditions undertaken by more seasoned fighters. Nevertheless, these young men and women were not naive, and Viking blood surged through their veins. Among them stood out Eric, a tall and muscular youth who dreamed of becoming a chieftain like his grandfather. He was impulsive, challenging norms and eager for action, which often led to clashes with others. Beside him was Ingrid, a girl with an unwavering spirit and unparalleled archery skills, always maintaining composure and strategic thinking, preferring caution and precision over brute force. Initially, they were not friends. On the contrary, they often feuded, competing for leadership within the small group. Also in their ranks was Arvid, the youngest of them, a 15-year-old who considered himself a mere apprentice but possessed the potential to become a fearless warrior. He was quiet, observant, and his natural intelligence allowed him to quickly grasp battle tactics even without combat experience. Alongside them was Freya, a strong and courageous girl who grew up in the family of a renowned warrior and understood the burden of responsibility placed upon her. Despite never having been taken into battles, Freya possessed an innate talent for combat and an indomitable will, making her a true leader. Despite their differences, these young Vikings shared a common trait, a love for their homeland and a desire to honor the memory of their ancestors. Although disagreements often arose between them, over time, the need to survive and protect what was most precious forged them into an unexpected brotherhood. Faced with an undeniable impending threat, they were forced to unite. There was no longer time for internal strife and ego. They were united by a common goal: to save the village and ensure the survival of the Viking people, confronting a force they could barely comprehend, but knew was merciless. In this atmosphere of tension and forced unity, the group was tasked with patrolling the border and observing the surroundings of Skari. Unbeknownst to them, they were about to become the last bastion of defense for a village that, in its humility, lacked the strength to stand against an invading army. While most experienced warriors had departed on trade and alliance expeditions, the burden of survival fell upon the young Vikings, and it was at this moment that the true story of Skari began to unfold. No longer just a village, but an arena of potential war, where unknown heroes, forged in trials, were destined to emerge and defy the inevitable. That day, night fell earlier than usual. The northern sky, as if anticipating the coming tragedy, was shrouded in dense clouds. The icy wind whistled through the crowns of the surrounding forest, and Skari village, with its flickering lights in the chimneys, seemed but a small dark speck amidst a vast ocean of ice and shadows. The group of young Vikings set out on patrol, searching for signs of suspicious activity in the vicinity. However, what they were destined to discover surpassed all their expectations. The sight was like a nightmare come to life. As they approached the observation point, which offered a view of a distant field, the smell of damp earth and snow mingled with something else. The sound of heavy footsteps, reverberating dully in the ground, cut through the icy air, and soon the horizon filled with a scene of indescribable horror. Before them appeared the approaching army of Harold the Conqueror, a vast mass of armed men, arrayed in orderly ranks, silently marching toward their village like an army of the dead. Eric, Ingrid, Arvid, and Freya froze, their eyes fixed on the enemy. Fear gripped them to the bone, their hearts pounding in their temples like distant war drums. Harold's army was not merely a threat, but a wave of destruction sweeping everything in its path. The fear that overwhelmed them was not the fear of ordinary combat, but the terror of helplessness, despair in the face of overwhelming force they could barely resist. They were young, inexperienced, and far from the warriors who could challenge Harold and his men. But at the same time, a flame of courage ignited in their hearts, an unyielding will to protect their home, their people, their heritage. And so, instead of retreating or hiding, they began to think, to plan, to fight with the only weapon they had left: cunning. Ingrid, taking the initiative, realized that an open confrontation with superior enemy forces would lead to inevitable defeat. An unconventional solution was needed. "Poison," she whispered, contemplating the plan. Knowledge of poisons and plants suitable for covert attacks was widespread among Vikings, especially among those who studied secret arts, such as pagan priests who guarded the secrets of healing and deadly plants. Ingrid, confident in her knowledge, gathered the group and shared her scheme. While Harald's warriors methodically surrounded the camp, the young Vikings realized that there was almost no time left. They had to act immediately, or their world would be destroyed. The primary task was to find poisonous plants that could be subtly mixed into food and drink. The icy cold of the forest seemed to intensify, and the rustling of dry leaves underfoot underscored the tension of the moment as they anxiously searched for deadly herbs. Arvid, possessing keen eyesight and a practical mind, was the first to find the right plant. He knelt beside a small purple flower, unassuming in appearance, but Ingrid, thanks to her botanical knowledge, knew it had a paralyzing effect, dooming its victim to a slow and agonizing decline. She instructed Arvid to collect as much of this plant as possible. Soon, other types were found. Hemlock, a deadly herb whose seeds, added to drinks, caused a slow and painful death. While Freya, Ingrid, and Arvid were busy collecting plants, Eric took on the task of preparing the poison. With precision and in silence, he ground the found herbs, carefully mixing them in a small vessel saved for a special occasion. The resulting mixture was extremely potent. Its effects would manifest within a few hours, but the consequences would be irreversible. The calculation was that by dawn, Harald's warriors would be poisoned, slowly and agonizingly dying. The young Vikings understood the gravity of their actions. Fear and anxiety pursued them, but retreat was not an option. The fate of Skari village depended on them. Despite the tension and fear, they executed their plan flawlessly. The poison was added to the invaders' beer pitchers and water supplies in sufficient concentration to cause catastrophic effects. The poison did not kill instantly, but within a few hours, it began to work, causing unbearable pain and incapacitating the enemy from fighting. Thus, at dawn, as Harald's army prepared to rest, the poison began its silent work. At first, Harald's warriors noticed nothing, but as the night progressed, the first signs of poisoning began to appear. The most sensitive ones started complaining of stomach pains, dizziness, and nausea. Gradually, the poison spread through their bodies, causing devastating effects comparable to a sharp blade. Panic erupted in Harald's ranks. Warriors, feeling weak and helpless, began to retreat, but for most, it was already too late. Many fell to the ground, lost consciousness, vomited. Others, unable to bear the pain, lost their strength. Chaos engulfed Harald's army. The warriors became disorganized. The weakest fell, and the strongest tried to understand what was happening. It was at this moment, when it seemed the tide of battle had turned, that the young Vikings of Skari realized they had saved their village. But victory did not come without cost. The sight of the chaos and destruction that befell Harald's warriors left an indelible impression on them. War always brings casualties, but seeing Harald's warriors retreating, weakened by poison, the young Vikings understood that they had done the right thing by protecting their home. When the enemy was weakened, the Vikings of Skari sent messengers to Helstad, warning the city of the threat. While Harald's surviving warriors tried to regroup, the Vikings of Helstad delivered the final blow, gathering their warriors and repelling the remnants of the enemy army. Thus, Skari was saved.